Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this month's webinar, October webinar. We're talking to the founders of EnergyFuse, Jason Eleson and Todd Bush. My name is Jason Assir. I'm with EnergyGigs, and my colleague Jason Fisher is also on the call. I think Jason and Todd, if I'll turn it over to you, Todd. Maybe introduce yourselves briefly, and then we can get into the presentation. And then if you have any questions during the course of this webinar, please do put it in the chat. Jason and I will be monitoring the questions, and we'll ask them of our panelists.
So, hello everyone, my name is Todd Bush, one of the founders of EnergyFuse, and we're kind of an advisory team focused on energy transition and doing a lot of work in carbon capture.
Yes, and I'm one of three Jasons on this call. Unfortunately for the rest of you, this should be like who's on first, I'm sure. But geoscientist by trade, and yeah, I've been working in especially the CCS, CCUS space for the last couple of years. Yeah, working with Todd and PK and some others on EnergyFuse.
Oh. Perfect. No, thank you for that. And so I thought today we would at least give you a little introduction about EnergyFuse, talk about some of the CCS projects and some of the hydrogen projects that are out there, and then get into geothermal and really talk about like who's hiring and who's doing what. I feel like Jason Eleson and I can talk about kind of carbon capture and hydrogen for a long time, but we have 30 minutes, so we're going to try and honor that and keep it focused. And then as we're speaking through some of these topics, feel free to throw us some questions in the chat, and we'll definitely save some time at the end for a little bit of Q&A. So first, kind of a little bit about EnergyFuse. So we're a team of advisors for energy transition, focused primarily on carbon capture and hydrogen projects, although we are doing other projects around energy transition. So you can see we have a team that has some great experience on the oil and gas side, CO2 injection, as well as subsurface and surface kind of expertise. So we can kind of balance the workload and balance the kind of skill sets that you need to tackle some of these projects. So a lot of the projects that we kind of work through require some expertise on the commercial and kind of I'll say kind of the upfront and project management side, whereas many of the others start getting into kind of deep subsurface analysis, as well as really understanding the ins and outs of the regulatory process. Obviously, with so much of the energy transition projects going through a kind of heavy regulatory, I'll say heavy regulatory side, we're astute in kind of matching kind of what the projects need and making sure you can get through the different phase gates and the different project stages to ensure you're actually getting to a successful kind of project. So on the carbon capture side, we actually look at this from an entire life cycle where we're thinking about characterizing the emissions, evaluating the subsurface, assessing the transport, planning and looking at the facilities that you need from a wells and pipeline perspective, and then also kind of pulling together the economics, which includes kind of 45Q, which is part of the Inflation Reduction Act, and understanding kind of how to monetize all that. So certainly kind of a nice, clean, I guess, slide that shows a little bit about what we're doing, but often we're kind of working in parallel as we start thinking about the emission side and who potential partners are for mini hubs and different hub projects. And then looking at the subsurface immediately thereafter to understand, all right, can you sequester some of this CO2 that we're going to capture and actually look at it or store it in a nearby kind of subsurface area, which takes a lot of the reservoir engineering, geosciences, and basically getting into some of the more, I guess, oil and gas domains, if you will, to evaluate some of that storage potential. And then getting into the facility side where you're thinking of transportation, pipeline networks, flow assurance, all this again coming from a little bit of the pipeline development projects, and if you're coming from an oil and gas perspective as well, then you probably familiar with some of the compression requirements, safety needs that are there. So you certainly have a lot of regulatory requirements within kind of the transportation side. And then as we think about kind of the wells and facilities, this is where we spend a lot of time talking about class 2 wells, class 6 injection wells, what the different requirements are for measurement, reporting, and verification, and how you're going to monitor those wells, and really what that looks like, not only right now, but how the EPA and other states are thinking about kind of managing the pipeline of projects that are coming in. And then lastly, kind of the economics piece. So as we're talking to clients about different projects, I think one of the things that stands out for many of the companies we're working with, as well as our team, is it requires a cross-functional kind of view, whether you're thinking about it from a project perspective, a finance or commercial side. Obviously, there's a tremendous amount of kind of land and regulatory needs that are required throughout the project. And then, of course, the engineering and design piece that is there. So all throughout, kind of, especially some of the carbon capture projects, we're thinking about kind of the subsurface and regulatory requirements as kind of the critical path to make sure you get to the actual EPA approval. But for hydrogen projects, geothermal, a number of other different types of projects, you're going to see something that's very similar, where you're going to have requirements on geosciences. You're going to have requirements for how you structure kind of the financial and commercial terms, and negotiating those different projects and contracts, as well as land rights, and understanding kind of the regulatory impacts if you're dealing with state and local agencies, to make sure that you understand the land rights and know how to move forward a energy transition project in general. So a lot of transferable skills that we're seeing from oil and gas projects to energy transition projects, especially when you start thinking about the traditional kind of domains of project management, land, finance, engineering, design, and subsurface. That's kind of a typical project, although this one's actually had the class 6 well near the industrial facility, so it's slightly aggressive, or maybe moves a little faster than some of the other projects that are out there. But just to give you an idea, here's a quick kind of a view of all the CCUS projects that are in the US. Obviously, there's some in Canada as well, but there's class 6 and class 2 well included in these kind of project outline. And then the green kind of icons show where those carbon capture facilities and projects are located, along with some of the orange kind of pipeline where some of those projects connect to CO2 pipelines. So maybe with that, I'll let Jason dig in on this slide as well, and then we'll go into more detail on the hydrogen.
Sure, thanks. So we'll just kind of start sort of geographically and talk about where some of these activities are going on and why. I suppose we'll start out on the West Coast and move our way eastward. So there are a number of groups out in California that are looking at CCS, and it's kind of a mixed bag. It tends to be some of these saline aquifers, deeper layers of rock that are just full of salty waters, for lack of a better term, without much oil and gas production. But there are actually, one company in particular is looking at storing CO2 in old oil and gas fields. And so there's various permitting going on underway. And I think, if memory serves me correctly, the state of California also has some incentives outside of the 45Q tax credits that kind of sweeten the pot a little bit. If we move west a little bit over to Wyoming, there's activities going on principally associated with CO2 sequestration right now in oil and gas fields, EOR programs. But there are, I believe, 3 different class 6 wells attempting to be permitted as we speak in Wyoming, and that's again targeting some of those saline aquifers. Wyoming has primacy. That's legal authority to regulate and approve Class 6 wells, as does North Dakota, and that's to some degree why you see a lot of circles or a lot of these little icons in those states, is because it's easier, and at least in a time frame perspective, to get wells permitted successfully in those states. However, there are a lot of permits in the pipeline, and we'll see how many of those get approved. You'll see there's quite a lot of pipelines centered around sort of the northern Midwestern portion of the United States. Many of those are seeking to go up to North Dakota. And one of the reasons for that is it's not that the geology is necessarily that much better in North Dakota, it's that state has primacy. And so the idea is to collect a lot of CO2 that's being captured principally from ethanol facilities, which when you create ethanol, you end up with water vapor and CO2 as a byproduct, so kind of a pure stream of CO2. And grab those ethanol plants in kind of that corn belt and take that CO2, pipe it up to North Dakota and dump it there. There have been some pushback associated with some of these pipeline plans. One company actually just kind of gave up on one of their pipeline operations that they want to do. And so the jury is still out to some degree in terms of will kind of NIMBYism, for lack of better words, stymie some of these plans to move between states, take CO2 pipelines between the states. If we swing down to Texas, we'll see on the western side of the state, we've got various CO2 injection programs. A lot of those are going to be in a geologic feature called the Central Basin Platform, which is a pretty heavily drilled oil and gas province where there's kind of nice fluffy carbonate rocks that would be ideal for sequestering CO2. There's awful lot of well penetrations there as well, and so some risk elements there associated with perhaps vertical leakage up old well bores, but pretty active nonetheless. Really, ground central is going to be along the Texas and Louisiana, or just the Gulf Coast writ large, and that's because there is the co-location of both large CO2 emitters from refineries and those sorts of facilities, as well as really nice rocks, specifically the Wilcox and Frio sandstones, which have produced oil and gas for years. There's a fair bit that's known about them, really good reservoir properties, good seal over the top. And for that reason, there's a lot of the bigger projects that are going on in those locations. As you move around through Indiana, Pennsylvania, et cetera, there are smaller projects, smaller programs right now. You don't see as much out on the East Coast, and it's not because of lack of CO2 point sources per se. It's more because there are some concerns with the geology out there. That's the Appalachian Mountains. Those rocks are quite old. They've been kind of bent, folded, and twisted. And there's some questions of, is the rock quality going to be good enough to inject at the rates we need it? And also, what about those faults and fractures? What's going to happen there? So still people looking around in those areas, but maybe not quite as active as other parts of the United States. So with that, we can move to the next slide, since I think Todd's got control of that. I'm going to talk about hydrogen in a couple of different slides. And hydrogen, I think, particularly for subsurface folks who've worked in the subsurface, I think there's going to be quite a few jobs coming in the near future, in large part due to some of the funding opportunities created by the Inflation Reduction Act. Here, in the last couple of weeks, the U.S. announced the winners of $7 billion worth of federal funding to establish hydrogen hubs. And you can see where they're kind of scattered across the U.S., but the idea is that they will have not only places where they can store CO2 in the subsurface, but there will also be facilities in these areas that create hydrogen itself. And there's a variety of ways that you can get hydrogen. You can do it by basically electrifying it, for lack of a better word, electrolysis, and that will split hydrogen and oxygen. Tends to be more expensive to do. But the good part about that is that all it takes is water plus an awful lot of energy to get that. One of the other main ways of doing it is through kind of steam reformer methods for methane, and that is again submitting methane under kind of high heat. It splits the atom up, and you liberate hydrogen, 4 hydrogens for every carbon that you have, but then you create CO2. And so interestingly, one of the knock-on effects of these hydrogen hubs could be additional CCS opportunities, particularly if they're going to end up doing, creating hydrogen from natural gas. Either way, these are major, major, major projects. And so whether it is, finding places in the subsurface to store the CO2, or to store the CO2, to store the hydrogen, or frankly, the billions of dollars of infrastructure at the surface that's going to be required for this, all very important and will be ramping up very soon. So I think hydrogen is going to be a really interesting space for those who want to work in energy, because there's a bunch of different ways that it could be impactful. If we go to the next slide. There also is the notion of exploring for elemental hydrogen, which for me, when I first heard this, I was like, how in the world would that work? That really doesn't even make sense, since hydrogen typically, is a very reactive molecule and wants to, say, join with oxygen and combust. But there are, apparently some subsurface situations that create, places where elemental hydrogen can be produced and trapped. So the map on the left is showing some work that Hytera Investors, who's one of the more well-known hydrogen exploration companies in the US, they put together areas where they think that there are sort of the ideal situations, background situations and geologies to go and search for elemental hydrogen. And one of the areas that they're focusing on is the so-called Nemaha Ridge, which is located in northeastern Kansas. And you've kind of got several different nice things going on at that location. Hydrogen can oftentimes come directly from the source as part of a degassing process, but particularly in old rift systems, and in the map on the left, if you kind of look just above where that red blob or that green blob is in northeastern Kansas, you'll see sort of this interesting gravity magnetic feature that runs northeast, southwest. That's an old rift valley. And where these old rift valleys are, you can end up with volcanic rocks that are termed ultramafic rocks. And these rocks can undergo chemical changes in the subsurface that actually create hydrogen, a process called serpentinization. And so you have these areas where you can be generating hydrogen. Interestingly enough, you can also create methane as part of this process, and CO2 at times as well. And all of these are going to be buoyant fluids that can, if they migrate into say a conventional reservoir with good reservoir properties, nice porosities and permeabilities, you could produce that. So the theory goes. So I think that they have started drilling on this Hytera well at Nemaha Ridge, and we'll see what the results of it are. But given that it costs a fair bit of money to create hydrogen, either through electrolysis or steam methane reformer units, this could be another way to create a low carbon footprint hydrogen source, as the case may be. So early days, jury's still out, but kind of an interesting potential kind of exploration type for North America onshore and globally. So if we go to the next slide, geothermal. So this, we've seen some heating up, if you will pardon the pun, after the Inflation Reduction Act, not quite as much as what we're seeing in the CCS or hydrogen realm, but still activities are continuing. And this heat map of the United States shows, frankly, where a lot of the heat is contained, which is going to be in the western portion of the United States, the so-called basin and range region, which has experienced extension, literally kind of the continent trying to break apart slightly over the last 5 million plus years or so. And you end up with sort of upwelling of heat relatively close to the surface. And so that tends to be where we chase what's called high temperature programs, where you've got temperatures in excess of 250, 300 degrees, 400 degrees, and things of that nature. There are other programs that they're looking at around the United States that are low temperature. That is, perhaps temperatures more in the 180 to 220 degree realm, where, perhaps instead of drilling down and using water you drill down into the host rock, the water that you pump down in there turns into steam, comes up a producer well, and runs a turbine at the surface. That's oftentimes the way it's done. In some of these other cases, it may actually end up being sort of a closed hole operation where you're not interacting with the rock formation itself, and you may not be using water. There are other fluids that basically can turn to steam and drive turbines and whatnot at the surface that are better suited for low temperature situations than water are. An example that's been fairly active or in the news most recently is on the right-hand side, the Forge site in Utah. And what's pretty interesting about that is that the kind of wells that they're drilling, and you can see on the right-hand side, there's actually two wells. One is the injector well, the other one is the producer well. And they didn't drill them perfectly horizontally, but they drilled them at an angle into pretty hot rock. And so what they're really trying to do by drilling horizontally as well as fracture stimulating these wells, similar to shale plays, is to really kind of open up permeability systems such that you get good throughputs of the fluids, you get lots of conversion of water to steam that can really generate electricity from the turbines that would be turning at the surface. And there are a number of geothermal projects being pushed forward right now, most of them in the Western United States. But I think as technologies improve, we could probably expect that to increase, particularly along, again, the Gulf Coast region. There tends to be some fairly warm spots down there that would perhaps be ideally suited for this. So if we go to the next slide, this was me kind of spitballing on the different sorts of skill sets that are required for these various activities as it stands right now. Obviously graded high, moderate to low. And frankly, some of these could change. For example, if you look at, say, operations geologists for hydrogen and geothermal, there's not that many folks drilling these kinds of wells out there right now. So probably not a huge demand for operations geologists drilling those kinds of wells. It's not to say that won't increase in the future, but it's just something to think about. And to be fair, particularly if we're talking about North America onshore, all of these operations will require less wells than, say, shale operations will. Shale operations require many dozens of wells per pad, and I don't think we should expect to see that. But that doesn't mean that there won't be operations or that we won't need good geologists and drilling engineers, completions engineers to do so. Nevertheless, there are a handful of skill sets that I find have been kind of in high demand, regardless of which sort of activity we're talking about. Petrophysicists, being able to characterize what's going on the subsurface using well logs is valuable in the exploration phase and in the development phase and in the production phase and everything. So I think it's in high demand. Reservoir engineers are pretty much always in high demand. They are being sought out from oil and gas industries, which is going to increase the competition for reservoir engineers for these other kinds of energy transition type projects. But one of the key points to think about, though, is that pretty much every skill set that we need for a successful oil and gas operation onshore is also going to be required for pretty much every one of these projects. Even where I've got low denoted, it doesn't mean that there's never going to be opportunity or that there won't be any wells drilled or seismic shot or what have you. But it's just, in my view, going to be probably a bit lower compared to the others. As things stand right now, I still feel like we're just at the beginning of this energy evolution explosion. And even in the next couple of years, I think some of these things may flip from low to moderate to high.
Hey, Jason,
Yes.
just real quick, we do have a question from one of the attendees. PK actually is asking, will be good to hear your perspective on complexity of wells, even though a smaller number of wells are required. Are there any technology hurdles in these categories that, complexity of drilling that need to be closed, I guess?
Oh, quite a lot. I mean, even if we go back and look at that example from the Forge wells in Utah, there's a lot working against you in terms of technical easiness. Those wells are drilled in really high temperatures, so there's a number of tools that will frankly just melt in the borehole if you try to run them. Drilling at an, apologies, I'm outside right now. at a cafe and someone has no exhaust pipe on their car. So in addition to, say the complexities just associated with running logging tools, wells drilled at an angle tend to be less stable and will want to collapse in. Oftentimes these terrains that are being drilled into, say for geothermal, are faulted or fractured, which can cause wellbore instability. And that's just the drilling and completions of the geothermal wells, let alone, say CCS wells, which are taking CO2 at very high pressures and injecting it underground, where it can mix with water and create carbonic acid, a corrosive acid that can etch away at the casing string. It can etch away at cement if it's not done properly. And so the way that I oftentimes put it is this is going to be the deep end of the technical complexity swimming pool that we're going to find ourselves in. This is not the shallow end. And really the kind of problems that we're going to be working on are going to be uniformly difficult or challenging, but fun. So I think that we're going to, really have to sharpen our pencils in terms of how the kind of work that we do, the kind of people we put on these projects. But I think that there's going to be a diversity of really cool work that we can do. And it's going to test us in terms of our technology and our know-how, given the complexities relative to something that's more well-known, like oil and gas operations.
That's great. Jason, we did have a follow-on question from Geneva Varga. As a recent environmental engineer graduate wanting to pursue a career in CCS, what advice would you have for me to obtain the high-demand technical skills you've kind of outlined?
Yeah, no, excellent question. Well, a part of it is, I would say, read early and read often. I've kind of made the switch over the last couple of years by reading papers and by talking to folks. I put out, kind of little blog posts and stuff like that online to let people know that, hey, I have some of these skills. And I think it can be a pretty typical thing for a geologist or an engineer not to want to raise their hand and say, hey, I have these skill sets, or hey, I have this interest. But that's honestly one of the best things you can do is to educate yourself and start hanging out with those kind of people who are working in this space. I have had countless people reach out to me on LinkedIn, particularly younger kind of early career geos and engineers, saying, how can I get into this space? And I effectively kind of tell them the same thing, which is don't keep your awesomeness to yourself. Make sure people know who you are, what you're about, what your interests are, and just stay at it. Stay persistent. I think trying really hard for a month and then not is probably a less successful plan. But there are a number of societies out there that are really kind of helping to facilitate this, whether it's AAPG or SPE or GSA. There are a bunch of groups, frankly, that recognize the opportunity there. And attending those conferences or serving on boards of those sorts of groups are really good ways to network. But one, even now, even though that it's an expanding space, you still have to be tenacious, and you still have to get out there and make sure people know who you are and what you're about and why they would want to bring you on board. Sometimes even before a job is posted out there, it's better to remove competition before a job is ever posted, because they think about you when they think about the job than waiting for it to be posted and be in the free for all with 100 other applicants, hoping that somebody actually spent some time looking at your resume. I don't know if that's helpful, but those are at least some early ideas.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, who is hiring? These are different companies that I've seen post on LinkedIn. A good place to hang out if you're looking to find work. I've seen these folks listing jobs in the energy transition space over the last couple of months. Some of the jobs that were listed may not be anymore, but the point is that there are a lot of groups, both private groups and governmental groups, that are quite active in this space. And don't feel like if you haven't got a job by now that you've missed the boat. Really, what we're seeing right now is the first tranche of jobs and work and people. And frankly, I think a lot of these companies are realizing, we need more people. We're taking on really big tasks. There's way more opportunity, or it's way more complex than we thought, and we're going to have to hire more people. And so, Tallgrass, for example, is a midstream company. They really haven't had a huge subsurface team, but they're building. And I've seen them list probably a dozen jobs over the last couple of months for every kind of geoscience, engineering, land position you can think of, as they prepare to become kind of a major player in this space. I have also seen a lot of both national labs, the USGS, and state surveys posting jobs specifically about energy transition. So some of it, honestly, maybe just depend on the geography of where you are in terms of where you might want to search, but look up those state surveys or USGS offices, et cetera, that may be close to you, because they're actively hiring right now. Okay, I think maybe we've got one more slide, unless there's questions or comments. Here we go. Okay, so this is my kumbaya slide, which basically to say is that there are all kinds of different opinions about what we should do given climate change, given that we still live in a society that is largely fueled by fossil fuels. What should we do? There's, in my view, and geologists absolutely love making ternary diagrams, of which we're looking at one on the left-hand side. I am no exception to that. And in my view, there's three kind of viewpoints: maintain, pivot, and adapt. And so the maintainers would say, look, oil and gas is an awesome energy option, and they've got a lot of pretty good facts to back that up. They may be more or less skeptical of climate change, but especially sometimes it's like, look, these sort of oil and gas activities are what feed my family, or what keep our community or our state going. We don't want to turn away from that. And for those maintainers, I think that there are ways that they can even contribute in the energy transition as they maintain oil and gas production. An example would be CCUS, that is using CO2 to help sweep through oil and gas formations to produce more oil and gas. But also, natural gas is an awful good feedstock for making hydrogen. So it may well be that they can help the energy transition by going and searching for natural gas. So conversely, you've got pivoters who would say, well, we've got to get away from oil and gas as quickly as possible. They kind of focus more on long-term timeframes, on what's going to happen to mankind. And there's genuine concern there, and they want to see us pivot as rapidly as possible. So for some of those folks, again, hydrogen and geothermal also, I think, are attractive options, but particularly as we focus on electrification, rare earth elements and critical minerals are going to be really important, particularly, for some of these batteries, whether we're talking about the fact that we need job tons of lithium or cobalt or the like. We would do well to expand beyond some of the current volumes that are known, that are out there, because they tend to be geographically distributed in fairly discrete spots across the world, and maybe not necessarily in the places where it would be advantageous to the United States long-term energy security, et cetera. And a part of the Inflation Reduction Act was, frankly, to stimulate activity in these areas, such that we could have our own, say, lithium extraction, processing, refining, and battery building capabilities here within the United States. Because right now, there are countries like China are whipping our butts hands down, no questions asked. Then there's the adapters, and this little circle with the line, the arrow pointing on the chart, kind of shows where I've been and where I'm heading, which is I'm getting more towards the adapt and pivot, but still have my maintain aspects. But for the adapters, these folks say, look, we need oil and gas. We do need to pivot away, but we can't do it overnight. We need to come up with kind of real world solutions for the complex problems that we have. And we really need to kind of come together and talk about what compromises could be made, and what strategies might we employ as we try to blunt the worst of global climate change. It's not that we're not saying it doesn't exist, and we're not saying that we can't do anything about it. But at this point, what we really want to do is get away from those really nasty scenarios. So what can we do? And I am more and more find myself as kind of an adaptation fan. And I think that the key punchline of this little slide is that it really doesn't matter what your political viewpoint is or who you're currently employed by. There will be more opportunities for the kind of skill sets that were typically the domain of oil and gas, it's going to expand and include other industries as well, whether we're talking about lithium brine mining or hydrothermal or hydrogen in all of its various forms. I think that there are ways that you can find really interesting, fun work, not just in the United States, but abroad if you're so interested. But what's fun about this for me is that, North American onshore has become en vogue again, and there's a need for the kind of skills that a lot of us with oil and gas experience have. So, that's the cool and fun place where we find ourselves. Although it is a little bit the Wild West right now. I'll not lie, and we're all trying to still figuring out which way is up. But I have found a lot of people reaching out to me saying, "Hey, would you be interested in doing this kind of work?" Which is just it's awesome, and I think that those sort of opportunities can be out there for other folks as well.
That's great, Jason. So we did have another question from one of the audience members. Sam Stevens asking, what about the role of maybe increasing energy efficiency, whether it's generation, distribution, smart grids? I mean, what role does that play in sort of this sort of framework, if you will?
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, I think none of this is to say that we shouldn't work towards those things. And frankly, the electrical grid in the United States is kind of ancient and patched together, near as I can tell. I'm sure that they're maybe not the best way to put it, but it could use some updating, especially because some of these things that I've read about are situations where you can have a smart grid where certain sectors could be turned off or at least dropped during off-peak hours, such that you can end up with a more even load balance for your energy for that particular grid system. Frankly, some of the different CCS and hydrogen technologies that I'm looking at seek to make things more efficient by using waste heat from other industries to drive some of these things forward. So it's frankly, it's waste heat. It was just going to go out and sort of heat up the atmosphere locally, and now you can actually use it to if it's for steam methane reforming or something like that, it can be a source of heat that doesn't have to come from some other source, whether it's a nuclear fuel source or burning natural gas or coal or what have you. It's useful in that way. So certainly there is much to be done in that domain. But yeah, for the purposes of today's discussion, I was mostly focusing on the different sources of energy that might change as time goes forward.
No, that's awesome.
And maybe just adding to that just a little bit, Jason. So one interesting piece on the number of projects that are out there, from carbon capture to geothermal, hydrogen, even some of the battery projects that are out there, there's an increasing demand for power. And so new power sources, higher efficiency, I think that's going to be a key theme as more and more of these projects get deployed and come online and need to have a reliable power source, not just and probably not just connecting to the grid, but something inside the fence line as an option. So there's going to, I think, be a tremendous opportunity there for jobs, projects, and companies to kind of jump into that space.
Oh, that's great. Well, I mean, Jason and Todd, this has been excellent. Thank you so much for talking to us today and speaking about like the trends in carbon capture and hydrogen. We had some good questions. I guess if people want to get in contact with you to talk further, like what's the best way for them to reach out to you guys? Okay. Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah, I think for email would be great. And then we're both pretty active on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out to us directly if you have some questions that we can answer. And obviously, if we can help in any way, please feel free to reach out.
Okay. Well, that's been it. That's our webinar for today, guys. Big thank you to Jason Eleson, Todd Bush. Really appreciate you guys coming and kicking some knowledge about carbon capture and the trends in decarbonization. This has been EnergyGigs webinar. We look forward to seeing you guys next month. Thank you again for attending, and you guys have a good rest of your day. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers.